What is up, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Not So Stupid podcast. Today, we have a very awesome conversation. I really cannot wait for you guys to hear this because I personally learned a lot from it, and you're going to hear me have a lot of pauses because I'm taking a lot of notes listening to all the new things that I learned, honestly, and I'm excited to be aware of and put into use with myself and with clients and just people I know in general as well. But getting back to the point, today's guest is Dr. Nahla. Dr. Nahla is a psychiatry resident, mental health educator, and advocate, and a wealth of knowledge in this space. We had a lot of fun in a nerdy sense of the way, talking about these different topics and sharing different ideas with each other. And I'm excited again for you guys to hear this because I have no doubt you'll gain a lot of value from this discussion and conversation that we had. Trigger warning though in advance, just so people are aware, there is going to be reference to abuse and sexual assault at points in the conversation. So I encourage you, if you're not ready or can't handle listening to that when it comes up, feel free to take a pause and come back to it when you do have the mental space and mental capacity to listen to it. But did want to give that warning so no one is caught off guard. So let's jump into the podcast. Here is the interview with Dr. Nahla. Okay, Dr. Nahla, welcome to the Not So Stupid podcast. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. I'm really excited to have you. You're a very thoughtful, thought-provoking person, thoughtful and
Yes.
thought-provoking, with all of your content on Instagram. So I'm excited to have you on and talk about all these different things. But first, before we get into that, I'd love to hear your story and how you got to where you're at today and what inspired you to kind of do what you do.
For sure. Thank you for saying that. I do think that I try to create content that is thought-provoking. So I'm glad that that's been something that you feel. So I would say my story, it's hard to answer this question, I think, because I don't know what people are asking. Like, do they want my demographics? Do they want my education? Do they want my social media story? Like, what do they want? But I'll just give you a bit of each.
Okay.
So I'm originally Syrian. I grew up in Canada. My family moved to Canada when I was just a baby. And I grew up here. And I, always really enjoyed kind of school, and then kind of fell in love with science, psychology, and sociology, interestingly enough. And then ended up doing my undergraduate in health sciences. And then the entire time when I was in it, thinking like, medicine is for me. This is what I want to do. I want to be a doctor. So I applied to medical school and didn't get in Canada at least. And then I applied to Australia and got in. And so I went there for school, which for some people listening might be like, what do you mean? Like Australia, like Canada's here and Australia is like on the other side of the world. And it's true. But there are actually quite a few Americans and Canadians in schools in Australia as international medical students. So I did my degree there, stuck around there for a year afterwards to do my intern year. And now I'm back home in Canada doing my residency in psychiatry. In between those years, mental health came up a lot, subliminally through my life, like how I felt. And I didn't even know that I was going through things like anxiety and agoraphobia and depression. But then, it also came up professionally where I felt like it was a very interesting specialty, challenging, but also a specialty where I felt my strengths were really, really highlighted. Like I could use my strengths easily and things were coming to me very naturally. So I just felt like I found where I belonged, like my calling in psychiatry. And then my social media story, I just basically, I came to Canada in March 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic to do a board exam. And I got stuck in Canada because all the flights were canceled, borders closed, all of that. We all know that. And so I ended up not being able to go back to Australia for work. And so that was the first time in my life where I was forced to do nothing. And it was agonizing. And I'm sure people listening will be like, oh my God, like, we're all so busy, especially medical graduates and students. If you can imagine being forced to do nothing, it's agony, it's torture. And I found social media as like an outlet to do things, to really like to create content and to learn and to be active.
No, I love that. It's a beautiful story. It kind of flows. It flows very organically how you kind of meshed everything together into this identity and authority presence that you have on social media, which is really cool. You mentioned how mental health was subliminally brought up in your life. And I think that's a very interesting word choice. Can you dive deeper about what that kind of means and what that looks like? Because I think a lot of people might be able to relate to this.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not proud of these things, but for example, I'll go back to like my first I think it was my second year. I was taking organic chemistry, and it was the hardest course I've ever taken in my life, like medical school and and undergrad.
Hmm.
It's brutal. And I couldn't do my exam. I was just paralyzed and I was not thinking well. And I was going through a lot of things at the time. A friend of mine was just diagnosed with something very severe. And it was a shock to me, like that a person that close to me could be diagnosed with that. And then lots of things going on with my life. And obviously I was young at the time and mental health was not super prominent that long ago, right?
Hmm.
So I just thought, I'm being weak. I'm not smart enough. I'm not good enough. And I'm never going to be able to do this.
Hmm.
I ended up going to the doctor and lying and saying, hey, I feel sick, which I'm sure all of us have done before, right? Because we think that, why would I go there and tell them I'm too stressed or anxious or worried or I'm going through too much, I can't do my exam?
Hmm.
I felt like he would just laugh at me. I thought my doctor would be like, what do you mean go home? You're not getting any letter from me. So I lied. And he's like, you're not sick. He's like, you're really not sick. So I don't know why you're here. And then I just broke down. I was like, I can't do this. Like I started crying. I was like, I can't do this exam. I'm so not well. He's like, why don't you just come here and say that? Like I could have just given you the letter. Just say that.
Hmm.
I was like, because I didn't think that that was a reason enough. And he was the first person that told me, no, that is perfectly reason enough. You're not doing well mentally. You need a break. You can't do this exam. And I was floored. Obviously, like little Nahla did not think too much about that at the time
Right.
because I was so fixated on like, get into medical school, get into medical school. Like I look back on that interaction. I think I wish that we had more people like that in our lives before. So
Hmm.
by subliminally, I mean like that was the first time it kind of just came into my life and it was like said, yet I kind of suppressed it and I didn't really believe it. I still thought mental health is a joke, to be honest.
Hmm.
I really did. So for most of my undergrad, I was like that. And then I went to med school far away from home and I began to get very depressed. I had intense agoraphobia. And for those who don't know what agoraphobia is, it's fear of no escape.
Hmm.
So I couldn't get into cars without feeling like nauseous, stomach pain, sweating, shaking, dizziness, headaches. The list goes on and on and on. I would not be able to get into a car, a bus, get in line, go to shopping malls. It was like my body was constantly hypervigilant
Hmm.
and I was always worried. And I had no idea what it was. It suddenly happened and I had no insight, no awareness. I didn't go to a doctor. I didn't get treatment. I was untreated for at least 5 years of this,
Wow.
all day, every day. Like you can imagine how sick I was and I had no idea.
Hmm.
I mean, I had awareness of the feeling, but I didn't know what it was. So by subliminally, I mean like it was all there, but I ignored it and I didn't address it and I didn't think it was bad enough and I didn't think I was unwell. But I honestly, looking back, I'm like, you could have been hospitalized. Like I
Hmm.
really, it was so bad at some days. I was paralyzed. I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't do exams. I couldn't get to school. Um, and then I met psychiatry in my third year, and I was like, I read the word agoraphobia and I was like, oh my God, everything clicked. I'm like, this is everything I've been experiencing for the last 5 years. And
Hmm.
when I understood it, I began to like heal it. So that's my story with that.
Yeah, no, that's actually a really powerful story, really interesting story. Because you're in a foreign land with, I'm assuming, at the time, probably not knowing too many people or not being as close with as many people,
Oh yeah,
right?
no,
Yeah,
no.
and that is a stressor in and of itself, and now you pair that with all these other stresses happening. It's kind of like the perfect storm to lead to this. Now, I think like when I hear the story that you said and using the word subliminally, it seems like a lot of it comes down to awareness and also knowledge of the subject and knowing what these different things are and how those come about, because like you said, you knew you felt these things, but you didn't think of it as something as serious as it was until you read about it and knew about it. And I think I think a lot of people can relate to that to some degree. what what so taking that and
Mhm.
taking it to how you're now in the mental health space, what caused you to shift from medicine to mental health, specifically in psychiatry?
Yeah. Well, I guess in medical school, you have a choice to make. Like, it's often people will say, like, are you medicine stream or surgical stream? Like, what do you want to do? Are you more
Hmm.
hands on or do you want to do more of like the critical type of work in medicine? And then, people forget that there's a psychiatry, that's part of that too.
Right.
And obviously several other specialties, obstetrics, gynecology. So when you're in medical school, you kind of gravitate towards something and pick a stream and work on that. And funny enough, my stream, I love geriatrics, which is an internal medicine specialty. I loved it so much. I did like maybe 5 electives, which is a lot in geriatrics. I loved it and I thought it was for me. But then when I was introduced to psychiatry for the first time, I reflected on all those electives and I realized, like, was it geriatrics or was it the mental health part of geriatrics? So the elderly that suffered from depression and that had multiple mental conditions and interesting neurology that also led to like their mental health changing. So I was more focused on that. And I realized, okay, maybe it isn't the medicine specifically, but the psychiatry aspect of it. But obviously psychiatry is a medical practice, right? So we're all doctors. We do have MDs. It's just that our focus is on the pharmacology of psychiatry and the physiology and the pathology of your brain and of your nervous system.
No, that's really cool. So you kind of had that epiphany moment of, the geriatrics was cool, but it wasn't the actual doing the geriatrics. It's the things that came along with it, the mental health of these older people that really you enjoyed the most. And instead of using geriatrics as a medium to get to that mental health point, you committed to it entirely.
Yeah. And I also realized like there were papers that we had to write in geriatrics that I couldn't, I looked back on them, funny enough, after like a year or so of realizing I wanted to do psych. I was like, oh my God, these are all about psychogeriatrics, which is a specialty within psychiatry. Like there are a lot of, I guess, psychogeriatricians or geriatric psychiatrists, however you like to use the word. But I realized all of my papers were on that. And I was like, oh my gosh, how is it not obvious to me? But when you're in it, you're not realizing what you're fascinated by. And then when you look back, you're like, oh, okay, well now that all makes sense. And it fit together really well. Like like I said, I felt like my skills and what came naturally to me was really highlighted in mental health. Like it was useful. I was very useful. I was very much like getting things done and achieving things that I hadn't achieved in other specialties. So it was a positive experience for me in terms of my skills and what I could do, but also in what I could achieve for patients too.
You felt like this really fit your strengths better than anything else.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's really powerful. And I like so far there's been like a little theme of how when you reflect on things, you're able to realize and recognize these events more and what better fits and better suits you, right? And I think there's a lot to say about the power of reflection in that regard, because you can't really experience or know your opinion, or not experience, I should say. You're not able to fully be present while things are happening in real time and know your actual opinion of the subject or fully understand what's happening. You have to take the time to reflect on that event and create that judgment for yourself or create that understanding for what you were going through to yourself. What do you have to say about the power of reflection? I would really love to hear your perspective as a medical professional.
I guess when I started doing it, like I never looked back. I never stopped. Like, when I started to reflect, it was endless. Now I'm always doing it. I don't know if it's just only reflection. I think it's also that when you're in a state of constant panic and worry, there's no room in your brain to reflect. That's a very calm experience. I think it requires a certain level of calm. Certainly you can get so good at mindfulness and reflection that even within the chaos, you are in the center of it and you remain calm, for sure. Not downplaying that, but I haven't developed that skill yet. Definitely not me yet. But I think I want to give myself credit that it's not like I couldn't do it. I just really was not physically surviving very well. Like I was just getting by. And then when things calmed down, when my life became more settled, which is now, like right now, I'm a resident. I don't have to worry anymore, really. Like my worries are now very, like in comparison to what they were before, they're like down here. I'm worrying about getting my notes done and my assessments done and maybe what specialty like they're exciting types of worries. Whereas my worries before are, am I going to get a job? Am I going to be unemployed? Am I going to be able to work in Canada? Am I going to match? Am I going to pass my board exams or do I have to do them again? Like the gravity of those concerns were so much heavier that my brain was not able to sit down and start reflecting. Like that was that was just impossible.
Hmm.
So I think the power of reflection is definitely there, but also like if you aren't doing it as much, it's not your fault and it's okay. Like there's probably a lot going on in your body and in your mind
Hmm.
that is preventing you. But once you get there, uh it's like a superpower.
Yeah.
It's really cool. Like the fact that like the days that I go home from work and I reflect and whether I write it down or I just think about like what happened today, why am I feeling a little bit burnt out or tired, or why am I feeling really excited? Like what happened today to cause that? Let's think about it. Let's break down my interactions or what went well. When I reflect, I am so much happier and I'm so much more calm and I'm so much more like present and focused and have a clear mind at work. When I'm not reflecting, I'm like kind of chaotic and just like I think the lack of processing of certain things makes me very unclear and not so present because my mind's probably trying to do a million things at once. But when you reflect, your mind processes that information, stores it away, and you're more present and clear. Like you have more space in your brain for the now. So it is very powerful, but it's a
Hmm.
skill and it takes time.
Yeah, I like that you emphasize the timing of when you reflect as something being really important, because I think people try to force it or try to force being better while they're in this survival mode state, and you're not going to get too far that way because now you're doubling the stress that you're
Mm,
feeling because you're worrying that you can't reflect in time. But I think there's, again, like you said, it's a superpower, and when you know the power of it and know the timing of when it's best to use it, you can continue to progress in your life and find meaning to things that didn't make sense to you before and use that to your
mm.
advantage.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah, no, I love that. That was a fantastic point that you made. So now something I want to get into, and this is something you post a lot about, that is kind of like a hot topic right now,
Yeah.
and it's about abuse and trauma. It's kind of weird to call it a hot topic,
Yeah.
but it's sometimes I feel like these strong words, when they get used more often, they lose a lot of their value, right? And people lose sight
Mhm.
of what the actual meaning of those words are. Would you be able to define abuse and trauma, professionally, and then like your experience of that?
Yeah. So starting with abuse, I agree. I think that that word in particular can be misused, certainly can. I
Hmm.
would define abuse as uh, any type of treatment that removes your autonomy, removes your reality, or questions your sanity.
Mm.
Um, so, like, I mean, obviously that's so broad, but like
Yeah.
someone who makes you, who separates you from your friends, your support group, your family, your job, that's someone who's kind of taking away from your reality or taking away from you and removing your autonomy. Someone who does awful things or says awful things or hurts you and then denies it or blames you, that's someone who's questioning your sanity. Someone who obviously physically harms you, I mean, that's abuse, like the more concrete types of abuse, sexual, financial, physical, those are
Hmm.
concrete. But I think it's the emotional that is misused because honestly, it's hard to define. But I would define it that way. And I could certainly go into more examples if you want later. But in terms of
Hmm.
trauma, I think I'm more someone who's trauma informed in the sense that if somebody is like feels some sort of connection to that word or feels empowered by it or finds healing in that word, just use it. Like
Hmm.
I don't think that we need to worry about the fact that a word is having its meaning taken away or it's now taken more lightly. It's like, okay, who cares? Like, does that impact you? Like, are you bothered by this? Like, why is this directly impacting you if the word trauma or the definition of trauma changes? If you associate with what trauma is, or if you feel that your experiences are defined by that term or you find healing in that term, go for it, use it. Like, how is that harmful to someone else? Obviously, if you're using it to directly harm someone else, or if you're using it to define another person's experience, that's not up to you. That for
Hmm.
sure. Like there are lines, personal lines. If the way that you define your experience with it, it helps you, go for it. But I think a broad term, I would say, because I heard this from, I think it was another influencer, but I forget her name. I'm so sorry. Anyway, she said that trauma can be anything that is too fast, too much, or too soon.
Mm.
So obviously, a lot of things come to my mind, like having a lot of responsibility as a child when you were just a child, being parented as a child, that's too soon. Too much is, too much chaos, yelling, screaming, turbulence as a child. Um, and not enough as well. So not enough is the neglect, the abandonment, the lack of attention, being belittled or demeaned, things like that. So that's how I would define trauma. And I would say if you feel like that word means something to you, use it. If you don't. I just don't feel like we should get hurt by that.
Yeah. No, I really love that point that you said, because, in the fitness space, as an example,
Yeah.
there's a lot of different things that scientifically don't work, different trends that scientifically don't work, but people really lean on and rely on. And a lot of the benefit really comes down to placebo, right? And to me, whether or not it's placebo, if it works, it works. If that's something you can gets you into a healthy routine, makes you feel a lot better, gives you mental clarity, I'm all for it. So I really love that you made made that point, and that connected a lot of dots for me. So I really appreciate that. But it sounds like, with trauma, it's basically something that is not falling in line with your capacity, right? In some way, like you have a capacity to do something. If something's moving faster than your capacity to do that thing, or an event is moving faster to do the thing, it's too much for you. And that can be a very traumatic experience. Can you talk about what it's like to experience that, like what it feels like in real time, for people to kind of be more aware, if that's all right?
Yeah, that's a good question. There will definitely be a lot of different responses and feelings in your body when you're being traumatized, but the things that come to mind are uh, the way that in traumatic experiences our bodies cope are fascinating, but very, very sad and very sad, as in like I'm not trying to make the person feel bad for experiencing them, but it just makes you recognize how hard the body works to protect itself.
Hmm.
So when you're in a traumatic experience, often what you will do instead of feel the trauma is do things like dissociate or depersonalize. So where you were literally be in the situation, whether it's a war, not enough food, poverty, abuse, your body will exist in real time, but your mind will be completely gone, and you will not feel real. The world will
Hmm.
not feel real. You don't know where your body begins or ends. You're there and you know you're alive, but you can't feel that the world is real or that you're real. And your body is honestly doing that in a way to avoid feeling some very painful stuff.
Mm.
It's a protective mechanism.
So you're kind
Um,
of like a spectator. Sorry to cut you off, but
yeah, and
yeah.
yeah, another way is like looking from the outside in at your body. Yeah, that's another way of doing it, or the another way of sensing it.
Hmm.
And other things that your body does and your mind will do, sorry, is that you will just minimize. Like you'll constantly minimize while you're in the experience that it's not that bad. It could be worse. It's I'm alive, right? Like I'm okay, or I have a roof over my head and I'm eating. That means I'm fine. Like all the ways that you try to self-soothe, because again, you're trying to separate yourself from the very painful emotions.
Hmm.
And then self-blame, guilt, and shame. A person who's going through trauma has a lot of shame. Someone who's like, for example, like a child abuse victim, which will have a lot of developmental trauma, part of that
Hmm.
is that their trauma will not be associated with the trauma, the person who caused it or the abuse they faced, but they'll say, I felt so ashamed. I
Mm.
felt like I was such a bad person. I deserved it. I'm the reason that I'm experiencing all these things. Like it's me. Everything bad is internalized. And that's also a way of coping with trauma. Again, to separate yourself from the fact that it's actually painful to say, well, that's my parent and they're harming me.
Hmm.
It's more painful to say that I don't deserve this. It's more painful to say I deserve better. Those are more painful than to just
Yeah.
say all my fault and that's it. It's
Mm.
easier to just say that. Your body is trying to protect you.
Hmm.
And these are all things that you continue to do even when you left the traumatic experience, or you've grown up and left the house, or if they're, if you have more money and you're, not living in poverty anymore. However, you've been able to escape the trauma.
Hmm.
Those ways you cope during the trauma persist, unfortunately.
Mm. Wow, that's actually Super powerful. I'm learning a lot in this talk, just so you know. So I'm like
No worries.
processing as we go. But that's a really cool thing. So like your body, obviously the main priority of your body on a very base level is to help you survive so that you can eventually reproduce. And in a way, you're saying it gives you alternate scripts kind of for what happens, if I'm understanding correctly, so that you don't face more pain and, reduce your chance of survival or making through a bigger stress. Is that right?
Yes, and you've just reminded me of another one, which
Okay.
is very common in sexual abuse cases and sexual trauma. And I hope there's a trigger warning at the beginning of this podcast. But
I will.
for those cases, I would say the most common one is forgetting.
Mm.
Your brain will literally just wipe the memory off. It's still there and it still impacts you. And I wish I could somehow explain this, but it's so common. Anyone who's been through some form of sexual assault listening to this will be like, yep, I get it. It's gone, but it's affecting you. The
Mhm.
impact is residual. It's there. You might have so much difficulty with physical touch, with intimacy, with men or women, whoever caused the trauma to you. You might be triggered by the way certain people look, but you have no clue. Like you don't know why.
Mhm.
So it's the
Mm.
protective mechanism in your brain is still there, and it's still scared, and it's still hypervigilant, but you don't remember what happened to you. It's
Mhm.
very common for sexual assault. I mean, that level of trauma is so painful, probably the most painful I've ever heard from people. But of course, your brain is like, I can't do anything. I can't even dissociate. I'm gonna forget.
Mhm.
That's so powerful. Your brain is like, I just want to protect you so bad. I'm gonna make you
Yeah.
forget.
Yeah, wow, like your brain made that decision that this memory is better off not ever being remembered than it is trying to relive it over, or like remembering it's the cause of
Exactly.
all these other things.
Exactly. It's reliving.
Yeah.
You're not gonna remember it. You're gonna literally relive it. Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's kind of crazy. So now, sorry, I'm just taking notes here.
That's
Um, okay. So now with trauma, it's a very powerful thing. We know how to recognize it in real time and also kind of in after it happens, looking back at it as you've experienced it. It's obviously not something you want to continue on living with or having it be as big as it is in your life, right? Trauma has different magnitudes. What is something, how can you heal from different types of trauma? And what does the healing process look like?
I love this question. So I would say I wouldn't want somebody to go through like the processing of their trauma and potentially even remembering or like you said reliving it alone. So I
Hmm.
would say before you get on that journey, try to find somebody to kind of guide you along it or just be with you along that journey to process it. So obviously my most generic answer is find a mental health professional, psychiatrist, therapist. If there's medications involved, certainly a psychiatrist would be better.
Hmm.
A therapist, life coach, whatever floats your boat, whatever will help you. But I think the most important thing is that when you're doing that search and finding that right fit for you is doing is doing some digging and doing some intersectional digging as well. So saying, I want a trauma informed therapist, not just a therapist. So making
Hmm.
sure you tick that box. I want a therapist that knows my background. I want them to be from this particular background. Tick that box. I want them to
Hmm.
have this religious background because I don't want to explain that to somebody. Tick that box.
Right.
There's so much spiritual and religious trauma too, right? That someone from the same background as you would probably be better at understanding and better
Right.
at helping you process.
Yeah. They know like all the nuances of everything that happened already. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So if you can find that, go for it. If you can't, then at least get the trauma informed box ticked.
Hmm.
And then from that, there's so many different modalities. So I recently learned about one called tapping, which is literally like
Hmm.
parts on your body that are, if you're familiar with it, parts on your body that are neurosensitive and can modulate that energy to tap on them. There's, I think it's EMDR. I believe that's
Hmm.
the acronym. So the eye modulating therapies, where basically it was invented by a woman, I believe, who took a train and
Hmm.
and thought through all of these traumatic incidents and painful emotions that she had, and from her eyes, like consistently moving as she was watching objects on the train, she felt like she was processing it and recognized the benefits, and then created a whole entire science out of it.
Hmm.
So we do that actually. There's lots of psychiatrists and therapists that do EMDR. Again, like forgive me if that's not the correct acronym for it, but
It's okay.
there's that. And then other trauma therapies. So there's like psychoanalytic therapies where it's um, a lot of talk therapy rather than like physical movements and and physical awareness, and I'll explain why that's important. Often in the beginning of your healing journey, self-awareness and like being physically aware of your body sensation is terrifying. It is so scary. Like you're not ready to do that. So
Hmm.
I wouldn't jump into like mindfulness and sensations and what 5 things are you feeling. If a person with severe trauma were to sit down and feel what they're feeling in their body on their own, they would be terrified. Like that would be a panic attack on its own. They don't want to feel how they're feeling. Like it's slow progress that you have to go into it. Um, so all that like mindfulness and sensation types of stuff, sure, it works later on, but I would not encourage you to throw yourself into that if you're severely traumatized.
Hmm.
Um, and keeping in mind that your body literally prevented you from feeling to protect you. Imagine if you forced it to feel what you haven't been feeling for years. Oh my, like the
Hmm.
it would be like roller coasters and firework. Like it's too much. It's too much for your body right away.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think taking it slow, using different modalities, and finding a right fit for a therapist for you is the concoction for healing.
Hmm. I like a lot of the points that you said, and I want to expand on a few of them. But before that, I've had a person who is a stress. She's absolutely brilliant. I've had her on the podcast twice. Like I love talking with her. She is her name's Elizabeth Kristoff, and her company is called Brainbased Wellness, and she focuses on the nervous system and kind of taking you out of the fight or flight response as often as possible and putting you back into, rest and digest, parasympathetic nervous system so that you can live a better life. And she uses a lot of the practices that you've talked about, actually the visual
Yeah.
thing. She had a word for it. It wasn't EMDR, but it's probably like just a difference in terminology. She talks about the ETF tapping on
Yeah.
the wrist, on the forehead, and things like that. And I've always found that really fascinating. And I've practiced it a few times, and it's kind of mind blowing how this very simple thing can actually change how you feel and shift your body into a more, again, restful and relaxed state. What it's I don't know, it's just so interesting because it's easy to dismiss that kind of simple stuff to not be as effective, but it really does work wonders.
I would say that it's very complex. Like when I read about tapping, I was very in out of my head. I was like, "What is this? Like, what even is this? This is so difficult for me to grasp."
Hmm.
And obviously, for people that are not maybe medically trained, or like me, I'm very systematic and very much like I like algorithms. That's why I like medicine. It just makes sense. Like you go through an
Right.
algorithm for diagnosis and for treatment. Like that's what I need for my brain. So when you look at tapping, it's so much more complex and it's hard to grasp if you are thinking that way. So
Hmm.
for someone like her who sounds incredible, it's important to have folks like her do this type of treatment because they probably really just get it. Like that's their skill set.
Yeah, no, that's powerful. I love that you said it like that. It seems simple at the surface, but it's got so many layers and
Yeah.
layers and layers to it. Yeah, no, that's really cool. One thing I like, the one thing you just mentioned that kind of reminded me, I wanted to talk about is um, objectivity versus subjectivity, and how a lot of this, you had said, is hard to measure because it is kind of subjective and it's up to the person to experience that. And even though you and I might go through the same experiences, we might perceive them differently and not see them to the same level of traumatic, or um, traumatic or not at all, right? What's there to say about that? Because I think when people see other people not feeling the same way, they again internalize that and feel worse about themselves. And
Mhm.
likewise, being the other person who experienced the same thing but didn't take it as hard, they think certain things about the other person. What's there to say about that
Yeah.
kind of empathetic relationship?
So you're saying like two people that go through the same experience and then react differently and then pass judgment on each other because of
Yeah,
their reactions
on each other and on themselves too.
and on themselves. Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I mean, first I'll start with the person. Well, actually, no, conceptually, like two
Yeah.
people can experience the exact same thing. Like,
Mhm.
for example, siblings are the prime example, right? Siblings grew up in the same environment.
Right.
You could argue it's like, how come one sibling turned out fine, whatever that means,
Mhm.
right? Like one, oh yeah, that one turned out amazing, and then one sibling didn't turn out fine by society standards. Why? Like, because everyone is different. Like every single one of us is different, no matter how identical our experiences are, and they never are identical anyway.
Mhm.
No matter how similar, I should say.
Yeah.
But I think it's difficult to compare yourself to like a complete stranger, right? Like someone that didn't go through what you went through, that didn't experience what you did. Like I would hope that we stop doing that. Period. Like we all have such a different upbringing, different, set of skills, different experiences, etc. Right? But we also have a different background, and we tend to forget like that with our parents and their parents and their parents, etc., came a certain level and set of traumas that were not addressed and are probably not healed, and that perpetuated either the exact same way or even worse, literally even worse. And therefore, that is embedded in our DNA. So all of us are set up completely differently already, right off the bat. So for me, like if I were to compare myself to someone else, and I shouldn't, but my setup, my DNA, if I were to experience the exact same thing as another person who grew up, who just has a different biological background, even then both of us would react differently. We've sustained different things, like our families and our biology has experienced different things. And one person might have a higher tolerance for pain, agony, experiences that are traumatic, and I might not. Therefore, I will react differently than them. So our biology already has a huge impact. And I wish there was more research on that, but it's hard. How do you assess the amount of trauma in a person's DNA? Like, it's hard. Anyway, so we're all set up differently right off the bat, like right off the bat. And then our experiences too. So a good example would be like if you grew up in a house that was very traumatic, chaotic, turbulent, violent, abusive, and you left that environment and you somehow succeeded in the world and did so many wonderful things, and all of the good things in the world happened to you, and you've somehow succeeded, but then you got into a car accident. Not fatal, you just got into a car accident, like most of us will in our lives.
Right.
That alone, that incident alone, because your nervous system has already had to manage so much, and it's done, and it's tired, and it's not able to manage much anymore. Your window of tolerance is lower. That alone can spiral you into a PTSD. Like that alone can cripple you. That alone can make you, not physically, I mean mentally, can make you so unwell. Whereas someone who grew up in a supportive home, calm, not super chaotic, not super violent, also successful, did well in their life, and got into a car accident, no big deal. I can deal with this. I got this. I'm going to be okay. The other person is not going to be okay. They've already, they're just, they could, I mean, they're not like they're not going to be because they chose not to be, but they could not be okay with it. So very simple little triggers or little incidents in our lives, we can have a different window of tolerance. The more traumatized, the lower that window is. You cannot handle more. Your body's already done and worked so hard to get to where you are. Every little incident like throws you off balance. Someone who hasn't had to do that, their window of tolerance is like this. They're not thrown off balance. They can handle pretty difficult things pretty well.
Yeah. So it's not always the incident in isolation. It's like everything that led up to it put together in most cases, right?
Yeah, like imagine someone who's wealthy, privileged, has a life set up for them, gets a D on an exam. Someone who's not privileged, who's paying out of pocket for their school, who works on the weekends, who it's the fact that they're in school is literally a miracle. Get a D on their exam. That's it for them. The other guy, it's fine. I'll pass the next one. I'll still pass school. I'll still have a job. I'll still be fine. The other person, it's over for them. The stressors are not in isolation. Right? We all have a context, and the risks. The consequences or the outcome of that stressor is different based on our context too.
No, I love that. Context is always the king of any situation that you're looking to answer. So we started a discussion on healing. We kind of veered off a little bit. I do want to go deeper into the healing process. You had mentioned, finding a guide that's going to meet you where you're at and is informed about as much of your situation as possible is going to be super helpful. Now, this is again, referencing what we talked about, abuse and trauma. It's a big buzzword. It can mean a lot of things. I think people have a lot of different expectations about what it looks like, but it's not always necessarily what the actual experience is going to be like. So can you go through what the experience of healing is and where you think most people get this wrong?
Oh my gosh. I could talk about this for an hour on its own. For me, healing was like more painful and more lonely than actually going through the traumatic experiences that I had to heal from.
Oh, wow.
And that's pretty much standard for everybody. The healing process is harder than the trauma itself because we've already discussed your body did a really good job at protecting you from the feelings that are associated with the trauma. It kept them at bay. It would even remove you from your own body so you wouldn't feel them. Like, can you imagine you survived because you didn't feel?
Mhm.
If you had felt everything that you felt or felt everything that you experienced, you probably wouldn't have survived.
Mhm.
You survive for that reason. And so the healing process is like, it's the agony of it all. It's the grief of it all. It's like you didn't even know that you were drowning and you're suddenly in the middle of the ocean, like trying to float and trying to breathe. You're like grasping at
Mhm.
air in the middle of the ocean, holding on to something and just trying to get to shore. That's
I
healing. You
Sounds like
just,
my worst nightmare.
yeah, thrown into the middle of the ocean. Like, "What? How did I get here? I have no idea." And it's because you looked inward for the first time in your life and
Mhm.
you're, like, lost completely. That's what it felt like to me, and so when we talked about reflection, like, it's funny because I didn't do much of it before, or I thought I was doing it, but it was so superficial and I really wasn't until I
Mm.
was healing and I actually was doing it, and it was ugly, and it was like you, like, look at yourself and you're, like, nauseated.
Mm.
It's, like, repulsed by myself. And I was angry and like just so much anger, so much frustration, so much grief of what I should have had and what I put up with and what I went through. And then there's sadness, and it's just every emotion, it's everything. So healing is painful, healing sucks, and that's why not a lot of people do it. Not a lot of
Mhm.
people actually look inward and do the process and do the work. And you see a lot of unhealed people just roaming around the earth. I don't blame them. I'm just saying it's not it's easier to live in fight or flight mode. It's actually
Mhm.
easier because you don't have to face anything.
Mhm.
Um, so anyways, that's what it felt like. And I wanted to add one thing about like the finding the therapist is not kind of the end all and be all. It's part of the process. There's a lot of work that you have to do. I didn't rely on my therapist. I probably saw my therapist like 6 times in total
Mhm.
over a course of like a year. Because I did my homework. I was journaling. I was exercising, I was changing the way I eat, I was going to a doctor. I was a doctor and I had not gone to a doctor in years. I
Mhm.
hadn't had my blood work done in years. Like, think about that. Like, I never even cared about myself. And I went to a doctor and I was deficient in like everything, of course.
Mhm.
So it was a process of not just looking inward, but being like, okay, like you are sick on the inside out. Like you need to look after yourself now. You are the priority. And for a lot of people who grew up neglected or abandoned or being told that looking after themselves is selfish, it's so uncomfortable. I hated it. I hated going to the doctor and I hated going to the dentist and I hated going to the eye doctor and I never wanted to take care of myself. Even now, like I have to admit, like even just simple self-care activities like a bath or brushing my
Mhm.
hair and like actually caring for myself, it's not comfortable. But it's sitting in that discomfort and saying, no, you deserve this. And the fact that you are so uncomfortable is because you've been so detached from your needs out of a need to survive. So be uncomfortable and look after yourself. And in all of that is healing.
Mhm. I love everything you just said right now, and I related to a lot of it,
Yeah.
in a lot of different ways, especially the last few points. But one thing I want to emphasize from what you said that I think may surprise a lot of listeners, but will at least help them a lot in a lot of ways, is finding the therapist isn't the end all be all, right? And I really, really love that one because as a fitness coach, I help people lose weight and help people with nutrition and exercise and things like that. They think a lot of times, right? Once they hire me, all their problems are solved and everything is done.
Yeah.
I took care of what I needed to do. But therapists, coaches, whatever other person you hire is there to guide you. They're just helping you, navigate you through the way. You're still doing all the work. We're not the hero of your story. You're still the hero of your own story. You
Yes.
have to
Yes.
travel through and do all the hard stuff and do all the dirty things. We're just the map, for lack of a better term, in a lot of
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that.
Yeah, no, so that's really powerful. I really love that. And now healing sounds like a very dirty, messy process, like you said.
Dirty, messy. That's exactly what it is. Honestly, I cannot stress enough how repulsed I was by the process, but it was worth it.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think the journey of it is dirty and messy. The destination is the beautiful part, but it's
Yeah.
not beautiful all the way up to that point. It's
Yeah.
rough until you get there.
Yeah.
One thing that I think happens a lot, and you had kind of alluded to it in a few different ways, is getting in your own way when you go through your healing process or trying to become better in some capacity, right? You find a way to self judge or um, self blame for different situations, and you get that again. You mentioned repulsing feeling, looking at yourself through another lens. How can it's super uncomfortable, it's super hard to get through, but what kind of advice do you have for people that are trying to go through that but really keep hitting a wall whenever they get to that point and can't get out of their own way?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is to accept that that is part of the process, right?
Mm.
Like there is no real destination. Like it's a journey forever, really. But I do agree with the fact that there is an initial period of healing where you are actually trying to get somewhere, and then the healing becomes much more
Mm.
like the back of your hand, like
Yeah.
muscle memory, right? Anyway, so with getting in your way, like it's going to happen. I think it's first an awareness of I know that it's going to happen. It's like when you're going through a process of recovering from an addiction. We know that there's going to be relapse, and that's not failure. Relapse is relapse. It's not failure, and
Hmm.
it's going back into that cycle again and not quitting, keeping at it. So we know it's going to happen. You know that sometimes your self judgment or your critical thoughts or the voice inside your head that you either heard from someone else or you grew up hearing or you were told, it's still there and it's actively working against it, reminding yourself that you're creating your own new inner voice. You're developing a new inner voice. It's going to
Hmm.
be, it's going to be tough to do that and undo years of trauma or however long you've experienced the things that you have in your life. um, but even while you were talking, I even remember, like, I don't know if it was a few days ago that I responded to something with a very clear boundary, and I felt
Hmm.
so crappy about it. And I was like, "You're like," I even said to him, "I was like, you're a joke. Like, this is a joke. Why do you care so much? Like, you're just doing too much." And I like thought about it the following day. I was like, "Okay, first of all, I'm not a joke, and it's so important what I did, and I stuck to my values, and I commend myself for it." So it's not like just ignoring the critic or ignoring the negativity. It's actively like squashing it,
Yeah.
actively saying no. That was important. What I'm doing is
Yeah.
important.
You're kind of
And
putting yourself in place in a way.
yes, yeah,
Yeah.
it's not really like I feel like it isn't really us. We
Hmm.
become so associated like of those things with ourselves because become part of ourselves. They become our
Mm.
automatic thoughts and our inner voice, but they're not really who we are. Like if we dig deep enough, it's our inner child that we bring out. It's who we really genuinely are, and that takes so much work on its own. But like I said, it's creating your voice, actually developing the voice inside your head that is authentically you, like what you really believe, not what society believed or your mother believed or your mother-in-law or your ex-partner that was abusive. No, it's you now.
Hmm. Yeah. No, I love that. I love that so much. And I think like that again, like I said, it's something that a lot of people probably face and they get in their own way and they get caught up with these expectations of what things should be like or how I should be acting or whatever else may be. But doing that, you know denies you of where you're currently at and stops you from moving away from that position. You have to accept where you are first and foremost before you
Yeah.
can get anywhere else. So I love that you said that. Okay,
Yes.
so we are coming close to the end of our time. I do want to be respectful of your time. Um, where can people find you if they want to see more of your stuff and more of your work?
Okay, sounds good. Well, this was really beautiful, by the way. I love this conversation. They will be able to find me on Instagram and TikTok. I post more on Instagram. My Instagram is I'm Dr. Nahla, and my TikTok is Dr. Nahla.
Awesome. Okay, and those are going to be linked in the show notes for anyone that is interested. And now, one final question for you before I let you go. This is the Not So Stupid podcast. We focus a lot on simplicity as a way to build a happier, healthier life. What is one simple thing that you would recommend the listener do right now, as soon as they're done with that, they could do as soon as they're done listening to this, that'll help them live a happier, healthier life?
Write. Write things down.
Mm.
Write your thoughts. Write what you're grateful for. Write what made you mad. Write what you're feeling. If you're feeling lonely or upset or frustrated or anything, write things down. I know everyone's like, so, well, not everyone. Some people will be like, I'm not a writer. It's just not natural to me. Put it down. Put it down. Like there's something healing in removing it sort of from your mind and onto a paper or onto a note or onto a document. Like, it's a form of release. No matter how annoying you find it, right? It will make your life better.
No, I love that. I always like to say for the people that can't sleep because they have their mind racing so much, that a brain dump, getting things
Yes.
onto paper and outside of your head, is the best way to get yourself from stopping yourself from sleeping.
Yes, exactly. And I wish we did that all the time. Why do we have to do that only when we can't sleep? Do it
Mhm.
every day. Like, when I started to like put my thoughts down on paper, or we have electronics, so I do use my notes app. I think I have 250 notes, by the way, because I just open a note and I just scribble. Like, oh my
Right.
God, this is how I feel right now, and then I close it and I open a note. Like, once I started doing that, oh my goodness, like I'm telling you, the amount of space in my brain that has had that I could be present with changed. Like, there's so much lack of presence when there's a lot of thoughts occupying space in your mind. Naturally, right? It makes sense.
Yeah.
So remove it and create space, and it allows you to be so present and just better, happier.
No, I love that because you get to experience life as it's happening instead of relive
Yeah.
different memories and different thoughts that you're gonna try to worry about. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, I love that. That's a fantastic one. One of my favorites so far. All right, awesome. Well, thank you again for your time, Dr. Nahla. I really appreciate it. I think the listeners found a lot of value in here. And again, if you don't already follow her, make sure to follow her. Great, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, thought-provoking posts that are going to really help you live a different life, live a life you deserve to live.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. And until next time, guys, we'll see you on the next episode.